Welcome to everyone who've braved the snows and ice. It's very good to see such a dedicated and enthusiastic audience. Let me start by introducing the context of today's discussions. For about 3 years now, I've been the lead investigator on a project called Hindu Responses to the Buddhist Critique of the Self. And we've had a series of papers written and a conference addressing the debates between Hindu and Buddhist schools in classical and medieval India, which is sort of at the very heart of the development of Indian philosophy. We've also deliberately contextualized the philosophical dimensions of these debates, which stretched roughly from 700 or 800 BC to the 14th, 15th century. So it was a very long and very sophisticated tradition. We made a conscious choice to explore these discussions in the context of contemporary debates, which are, of course, rooted in and informed by the Western philosophical history of very similar questions. Unfortunately, my co-investigator, Professor Janardhan Guneri from Sussex University, could not be with us. And in the spirit of the true scholar, he's holed up in Kathmandu looking at medieval texts on this very topic. So I have instead with me, let me introduce myself. I'm Chakravarti Ramprasad, and I'm at Lancaster University. So I have with me Dr. Irina Kuznetsova, who is the research associate, and she worked in Lancaster for 2 years and is currently in Sussex University for the later half of the project. And Dr. Brian Black, who is at Lancaster University as well. So both of them have worked on these topics, especially the historical context, as well as some of their contemporary resonances. So what we are going to do really is give you a taster of 3 different types or aspects of this very complex debate and approach it from slightly different angles. So we're going to have Brian setting up the historical origins of this debate and the way in which it informed some of the earliest developments in Indian history of thought. Some of the debates and some of the arguments have a certain kind of misleading clarity to them, because on first reading they seem to suggest certain obvious disagreements or certain obvious positions which are being debated. But it then turns out that the relationship between the 2 sides of the debate is much more complex than that, and what each side means and the range of views that are found on each side is actually quite a complex state of affairs. So Brian will be talking about the history, the interaction, the origins, and the nature of that early development. I then want to talk more about some of the conceptual issues involved, and particularly I want to talk about how there are different registers in which this argument about the self happens, what is meant by the self, what are the English words we are choosing to use for debates which were, after all, conducted primarily in classical Sanskrit or in other pre-modern Indian languages. We'll then have a break after that, a short break, and then Irina will be talking about a topic which is at the heart of a lot of contemporary sort of discussion, not only philosophical but also in areas like the neurosciences and psychology and so on, which is the role of emotion. Again, something that is existentially immediate and something that seems obvious to people plays a role in human life, and the relationship between questions about the nature of emotion and these rather more often abstract and philosophical questions about the nature of self. For each of these presentations, we're going to have 15 minutes of discussion straight afterwards on the specific aspects of the talks themselves. And we also hope to have a concluding section where we can all review together where these debates have gone and where the questions are. So I hope that we can have a fairly interactive session through this afternoon. So without much ado, I'll then introduce Brian and ask him to give the first talk.
First of all, I want to say that I'm very happy to be here at Gresham College. I lived in London for 12 years. For most of the time I lived in London, I was associated with SOAS. And I also, in those years, spent 7 years teaching at Birkbeck College. And I'm very happy to see that some of my former students from Birkbeck are here amongst us today. So I'm very happy, in a sense, to be home here in central London. And thank you for coming. What I'm here to talk about today is to give a sort of historical background, as Ram suggested. And what I'm going to do is talk about how issues of the self, what the self is, particularly in terms of asking questions about what is consciousness, or who is it who we really are, what is it that gives us life, that's responsible for us being alive, what happens to us when we die, how do we explain those processes, that these sorts of questions, which are still vital, central questions today in Western philosophy, were at the very core of ancient Indian philosophy as well. In fact, some people might argue that, in a sense, that was the beginning of Indian philosophy, when people started to ask these sorts of questions. But in ancient times, in ancient India, about 2,500 years ago, you had different groups asking these sorts of questions, and they came up with different sorts of conclusions. As Ram suggested, these two different groups actually have a lot of overlap, so sometimes it's not so easy to distinguish between the different interpretations that they had. However, what I want to do is give you a little bit of a taste, a little bit of a background of who these groups were and what sort of issues were a part of their debates. Basically, the two groups that I'm going to be talking about, simply put, are Hindu philosophers and Buddhist philosophers who came up with different interpretations about ideas of the self. I want to start by talking about some texts that are very important within the history of Hinduism, a group of texts called the Upanishads. I'm sure some of you might have heard of them. Certainly anybody who ever took one of my courses at Birkbeck probably heard more about them than you even thought you ever would. But I want to say a little bit about the Upanishads, because they're some of the oldest philosophical sources from the Indian context. And they're also some of the sources where we first see this question of what is the self is being very much addressed. The Upanishads were composed in Sanskrit. They were composed orally, so they were oral texts, and they were transmitted orally for several generations, long before they were ever written down. And the Upanishads are also compilations, which is very important, in the sense that there's not a single author. They weren't all written within the same even decade or so. They were written over a period of composed orally over a period of several hundred years. Probably the ones I'm talking about between the years of about 700 and 500 in the Common Era. And one of the kind of results of the Upanishads being a composite work is that even though many Upanishads ask the same sorts of questions about the self, even within these texts, we have different answers put forth. There are a number of different philosophers who we meet in the Upanishads. We have stories about different philosophers and their interactions with each other, and a number of them put forth different sorts of views about the self. One particular philosopher was a chap by the name of Uddalaka Aruni. And we meet Uddalaka Aruni in a number of stories in the Upanishads, some of which in which he was teaching his son, Shvetaketu. And in one particular case, when we meet Uddalaka Aruni, he takes his son aside and he starts teaching him about the self through a number of analogies to life processes that we might see in our everyday life. So, for example, he compares the self to rivers flowing into the ocean. And so whereas the self in every one of us might be akin to a particular river, they all merge together in one big ocean. And his point in saying that is, in a sense, that the self that is in us is the same self that is in other people, and that at some point it will all merge together, and there's not some differentiation between individuals in that way. He makes similar analogies, talking about bees gathering nectar from different flowers to make honey together. And he's arguing that, in a sense, that in every time that nectar is gathered, that there's that essential something in the nectar that then is merged together when honey is created. Now, one of the very interesting things about Uddalaka Aruni's teaching is that when he's talking about the self, one of the things that he's really interested in is what makes us alive, what gives us life, and also what happens to us when we die. Another teacher we meet in the Upanishads is the teacher by the name of Yajnavalkya. Now, Yajnavalkya asks some similar sorts of questions, but interestingly, he provides a sort of different set of answers to them. So whereas Yajnavalkya also uses some analogies based on natural phenomenon, Yajnavalkya seems particularly interested in a more kind of cognitive explanation of what the self is. So he explains the self in terms of the thinker behind the thinking, or the one who smells behind the sense of smell, the one who touches behind the sense of touch. And so in Yajnavalkya's teaching, there's this sense that everybody has some, what he calls a kind of inner controller, some kind of unified agency that connects together all the different cognitive and sense capacities that what we do. Now, I think that both Uddalaka Aruni and Yajnavalkya would agree that there is a self, and they would also agree that the self is what gives us life, that makes us alive. And both of them are concerned with the question of what happens to us when we die, what happens to the self after our body dies. However, I think we can see very interestingly that they choose to talk about it in different ways. There's a different emphasis there. And so while one focuses more on a kind of naturalistic explanation of selfhood, the other concentrates more on a cognitive explanation of selfhood. I want to say one more thing about the Upanishads that make them particularly interesting to me in terms of thinking about issues of the self. And that is that a lot of the Upanishads are presented in a dialogue form. So they're not discursive philosophy in the way that a lot of us might read philosophy today if we're reading Wittgenstein or Heidegger or somebody like that. The material in the Upanishads is much more like what we might encounter if we're reading the dialogues of Plato, that we get these dramatic scenes about individual people talking about philosophy. And sometimes these scenes are quite dramatic because we see a lot of tensions and rivalries and debates going on against different people. And we also get this sense that there's a lot at stake in these discussions, that these weren't just these kind of abstract discussions amongst philosophers, but the stories at least make it seem that these questions were relevant to everyday life, they were relevant to kings, they were relevant to being a top philosopher to get more students, to get a livelihood, to get more money, etc. And so in this way that we see that from the very beginning of philosophy in ancient India, that these questions about the self, which I think intuitively we might think is one of the most kind of personal sort of question that one could ask, it's always presented in a dialogical setting. It's always presented in an interactive setting where people are in dialogue and debate with other people. One of the interesting things about the Upanishads is basically they argue that the best teachings about the self, the only really legitimate ones, are ones you learn from a proper teacher. So it's not enough just to go off and speculate about who you are by yourself off in the woods somewhere. That really the only real way to discover who you are is through your interaction with other people, even though what they're talking about is a very specific sort of interaction with other people. So that's a little bit about the Upanishads. If you have further questions, we can go over those during the break. I mean, during the question time. But now I want to say a little bit about some of our early Buddhist sources and what they say about the self. Now, the word for self that's used in the Upanishads, the Sanskrit word, is this word Atman. And the Buddhist word that's used in the earliest Buddhist sources when they're talking about issues of the self is the word Anatman, which means that the easiest way to translate that would be no self or not self. So seemingly, the Buddhist position seems to be a clear rejection of the very position that we see in the Upanishads. And that is borne out in a number of contexts. So, for example, one of the ways in which issues of the self are talked about in a Buddhist context is they completely reject this notion, for example, that there's any kind of inner controller, as our philosopher Yajnavalkya would put it. They reject this sense that there's some kind of unified agent behind all the dispersed activities of our sensing and cognizing. From a Buddhist perspective, rather than arguing that there must be some kind of ghost in the machine, as we might put it in contemporary terms, they argue that really all we have are the workings of the machine, and that these workings can be separated from each other. And so what seems like some kind of unified controller, what seems like some kind of base or foundation for all our disparate activities of sensing and cognizing is actually just our own misperception. And that this more Upanishadic idea of there being some kind of core or foundational self just doesn't really work. Now, the Buddhist texts, interestingly, show a lot of indications that they might have been directly influenced by the Upanishads. So, for example, there are a number of stories that feature in the Upanishads that also reappear in the Buddhist sources. Sometimes the characters are given different names, and sometimes the things they talk about all, of course, lead to a more Buddhist conclusion. But sometimes we see the same kind of story structure in the Buddhist sources, suggesting that either it's a direct influence from the Upanishads or that they're sharing a literary culture with each other. Also, there are some occasions where the Buddhist sources use some of the same terminology. So, for example, ideas of the inner controller are explicitly rejected by the Buddhist sources. Also, on some occasions, the self in the Upanishad is depicted as something that is joyful. And this very term, Ananda, is rejected in the Buddhist sources. So there are a lot of indications that the Buddhist sources are directly refuting what the philosophers in the Upanishads were saying. Now, another thing that's similar between these two groups of sources, these two traditions of literature, the Upanishads and the Buddhist sources, is that the Buddhist sources are also composed in a literary style where there's dialogue and debate and discussion. So, these discussions about anatman, these discussions about there being no self or not self, again, aren't these kind of philosophical discourses that are without the interjection of characters that we might see today, but instead depicted as these literary scenes with different Buddhist characters discussing these ideas. And again, that might lead us to think that there's some kind of shared literary culture between them. Now, one of the things that I've been looking into specifically in terms of this project is trying to push that interpretation a little bit further and ask to what degree were the Buddhist notions of not self really influenced by the Upanishads. And as I said earlier, I think that there is a lot of reason to think that they were. However, one of the things that's fascinating to me is that in the Buddhist sources, in the very situations where Buddhists are talking about this issue of not self, I ask myself, who are they talking to in the stories? Who is the audience that is depicted in the text? Now, interestingly, the most prevalent audience is other Buddhists. So, in these stories, oftentimes when the Buddha is depicted talking about issues of not self, the most likely audience that is in front of him is an audience of his own followers. Another audience is people from rival religious and philosophical groups. And we know at that time it wasn't just the Hindus and Buddhists who had different ideas of the self, but that actually there were a number of other groups as well. For example, the religious tradition Jainism, some of you have heard about, also emerged at this same time in ancient India. And so Jains had their own ideas about what the self was, and they're depicted in the Buddhist sources as some of the Buddhist main rivals. There's another group called the Ajivakas. Most of you probably haven't heard of them. A good reason for that is that their traditions seem to have died out a long time ago. But they were a very important rival group at this time. And in the Buddhist sources, we see that they're a main rival of the Buddhists when they're talking about these things. Interestingly, however, there's no situation that I can find, at least, in the text that we have available, where the Buddhists are actually arguing directly with the Hindus about their position of not self. Now, what that is particularly kind of fascinating to me, because throughout the Buddhist sources, the Brahmins, the Hindus, are depicted as the Buddhists' main rivals on almost every other issue. And so when it comes to the issue of selfhood, they don't talk about these issues, at least in the stories, with the Brahmins representing the Hindu tradition themselves. And so what that leads me to believe is that, yes, there is an Upanishadic, there is a Hindu influence on the way that the Buddhists articulated their notions of selfhood, or their notions of their not being a self. However, it would be wrong to think that the Buddhists articulated their notions of selfhood purely for a Brahmanical audience. That actually, it seems that other groups might have been their main rival on this subject, even though Brahmins were their rivals for other topics. Okay, I think that I'll stop there because I've covered the main things that I wanted to say. I don't know if I've gone over or if I've gone under, but I'll just open it up to any questions you might have. Yes?
Two quick things. You talked about the compilation or putting in writing between 500 and 700 AD, you know, the Common Era,
Yeah.
for the Upanishads. But I don't think you gave a date for the Buddhist writings, so
Yeah.
it would be interesting to hear if they were written about the same time, so we can get some feel as how much influence
Yeah.
they might have made.
Very good question.
And the other question is, as you say they're rivals and they're arguing different ways, was it really just an argument for philosophy or for the intelligentsia? Did they have anything further from that that would make it real, that you should believe their way rather than the other way?
Two very good questions. Thank you. The first is, so let me just repeat what I said about the Upanishads. The Upanishads that I'm dealing with were composed probably between about 700 and 500 before the Common Era. Now, of course, anytime we're talking about dating texts or the dates of people in an ancient Indian context, it gets really fuzzy and controversial. But this is, I would say, scholarly consensus. The dates of the sources, the Buddhist sources that I'm talking about, date anywhere between about 500 and 300 before the Common Era. Most scholars would agree that the Upanishadic material that I'm talking about predates the Buddhist material that I'm talking about. I think most disagreements are about how much it predates. Is it a few decades or a few centuries? And I think that there's some very interesting debates about that because they would have very different sorts of implications. The Buddhist sources, from what we know, were probably also composed orally and transmitted orally initially, but they were written down most likely a few centuries before the Brahmanical material. So even though it was newer on the scene, it was probably earlier to be written down. Okay? Now, your second question, a very good one. You know, so what's the point of these discussions? What's really at stake here? And I think that's a very good question because there was a lot of stake. And one of the reasons that I pay so much attention to the stories and the characters in the stories, and not just the content of what they talk about, is because the details in the stories and the details about the characters gives us a lot of information, at least to begin to address these sorts of questions. So, for example, both the Upanishads and the early Buddhist material depict these discussions about the self as if they're vitally important for a king. And that's interesting for a number of reasons. One is it seems like there was a kind of model of a kind of philosopher king, if you will, that somehow part of the, in a sense, propaganda coming from the Hindu and the Buddhist philosophers themselves is that, hey, if you want to be a good king, to take yourself seriously, you need to know this sort of information to kind of prove that you're a legitimate leader. And then also, you can see that when they competed against each other, a lot of times they were competing against each other because there was already seemed to be a system in place that the very best philosophers were part of a king's entourage and were part of the court, so would get some degree of patronage. So it seems that when Brahmins are, say, competing against Jains and the Ajivikas and the Buddhists, that in a sense, part of what they're competing is who's going to have the ear of the king, or who's going to, establish themselves as having a presence in the court. So these are at least some of the ways. There are other ways, and maybe during a break I can, get into other things. But I think that addresses your question to a certain extent. Yes.
You're emphasizing the self. Could you just
Oh, sorry.
You're emphasizing the contrast in the way these two groups have looked at the self. But were there other important differences, just to put it into context, between the two approaches?
Absolutely. Another very good question. I mean, obviously, for a day like today, when our theme is the self, I'm concentrating on the self. But yes, and I think that that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that this is just one of several debates that is going on at this time. I mean, one way to look at it is that the Buddhists particularly, but all the new religious movements that emerged at that time in ancient India, including the Jains and the Ajivikas, they were all, in a sense, competing with each other. But I think for all of them, the Hindus at that time were the main target, at least initially. And some of the things that they were competing about were rituals as well. What rituals are valid and what are the valid procedures for performing rituals. And in any pre-modern time, rituals are very important, again, for establishing political power. Which priests who performed rituals who could, in a sense, promise the best results from these rituals would be in a very good place, to be in a very powerful position. So again, there's a kind of connection to kingly politics. Also, they were arguing more on the lines of religion. I mean, we could say that another very important part of the Hindu tradition at that time was having this textual tradition called the Vedas. And one of the things that kind of gave the Hindu tradition at this time such a strength is they shared this already quite old and authoritative textual tradition. So these new traditions, in a sense, were gathering their materials together, new texts with new kinds of teachings that would address different sorts of audiences. So on a lot of different fronts, these groups are arguing with each other. I think one of the main points to make in the context of today is that philosophy, or these issues that we might call philosophy, were a vital part of these ongoing debates. But as your question, I think, very insightfully raises, is that it's just one of other parts.
The other examples you've mentioned, though, tended to be less philosophical rituals, for example.
Yeah.
The texts, not quite comparable with philosophical differences about how you look at the self.
Right, but I thought that's what you wanted me to... I thought that's what your question was asking.
Other philosophical differences?
Other philosophical differences. Absolutely. I mean, I think that the self was such a central issue that a lot of the other philosophical issues, in a sense, are connected up with these positions put forth about the self. But, for example, they had different ideas of how karma works. They had different ideas of how the process of rebirth works. Now, of course, because the self is central to those philosophies, it's not completely separate. But I didn't talk about these things because of our time constraints and stuff. But yes, there were definitely other philosophical issues that they were arguing about.
Maybe I should come in.
Okay.
Even the questions of ritual, part of what we might still think of as philosophical issues. While the details of ritual performance, of course, are not traditionally thought of as philosophical, the reason ritual was such an important part of ancient Indian culture was because it was thought to constitute certain kinds of order, especially the way in which the performance of order in human action mapped onto or integrated the human into a larger cosmos. So there were these cosmogonic notions of where did the world come from, in what did its order consist, what could human beings do, how were they located within that larger world, such that anything they could do would have consequences for the world itself. So these were larger issues about human existence and its meaning, in which ritual action was an exemplification. So even what looks like not particularly philosophical could turn out, in fact, to have philosophical consequences. I think.
Yeah, also what you were saying, I think I know a little bit about the Buddhists, but nothing really about the Upanishads. But we're also talking about selflessness as a way of reaching liberation. So it's a soteriological question as well, which is very important. Because the implication of the two different ideas of self, and also agreeing because of the notions of karma, would lead to different ways of leading one's life. And that becomes very important, how one leads one's life, if one uses one idea and the other. So I think that's really important, is that it really makes a different motivation to how one leads one's life, and therefore the results may be quite different. So it's a really important dialogue.
The soteriological differences, I think, are absolutely vital. That's a very good point for bringing that up. It's interesting that in some Buddhist contexts, they don't even say that believing, in some Buddhist contexts, they acknowledge that a knowledge of self in a kind of more Upanishadic way might bring you the rewards of heaven. So they don't say, that knowledge doesn't lead to the results that it claims. Instead, they argue, but who wants heaven when what we really should be aiming for is nirvana? So these battles were not just about how we conceptualize self, but the implications of those concepts, absolutely.
They use the analogy of an arrow, and that when the energy of the arrow is expended, then it falls down to earth again. And they say that inevitably that's what happens. You enjoy heaven, and then when the energy is exhausted, then you're reborn again. And you're no better off.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting point, is that before there was really a well-articulated notion of rebirth in the Hindu tradition, there was an articulated version of re-death, which is basically what you're describing. There was the sense that, yes, if you perform your rituals properly, and then you have a son that perform the rituals properly after you die, that'll earn you a place in heaven. But the problem with that is that you're not guaranteed to stay there unless your family members continue to perform these rituals for generations and generations. So that's a very good point.
You did mention the roots of Buddhism involve animistic religion or animistic practices. And it occurs to me that this idea of no self possibly comes from the animistic attitude to the world around, particularly if you compare Buddhism to Taoism, where the whole point of Taoism is, if you understand it, you haven't understood it, so it's a paradox all the time. And this idea of no self, I don't know if Hinduism had roots in any kind of animistic practice, but it seems to me that that's where the idea of no self comes from. You identify with the world around you.
mean, that's an interesting suggestion. I think with the sorts of texts with the sources that we have, it's very difficult to find origins. All we can see is how are the ideas articulated, what sort of engagement is going on. And so I think in the sources that we have, it's clear that, as I mentioned, that there is an engagement with Hindu beliefs of self, engagement not only in terms of the ideas, but the form of how these ideas are presented in terms of dialogue, the same stories, similar metaphors, things like that. And, of course, there were other rivals as well. But one of the things I think that has been a kind of disservice to our understanding of Buddhism is when scholars have, in a sense, overemphasized the importance of not self, this notion of not self within early Buddhism, and then basically seeing the entire Buddhist tradition as somehow being nothing more than a protest movement against the Upanishads in Hinduism at that time. And I think one of the things that you're bringing up is very important, is that Buddhism, whatever its origins might have been, definitely had a number of different influences. A lot of those influences were probably regional and involved things such as animism, as you're suggesting, and that where this notion of not self comes from, we don't know. But we do know that the first articulations of this idea are already in a situation in which it's in dialogue and engagement with these other traditions that are going around at the time.
But I can just add that as far as I know, neuroscience hasn't come up with any definite self yet either.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that makes these debates interesting, I mean, first of all, I'm just, as kind of historically minded person, I'm just fascinated by the ancient Indian context. I could just be looking at that for its own sake all day. I mean, I just find it really interesting that these are the sorts of things that they were discussing and talking about. But I think one of the reasons why I find this material so rich and exciting and even profound for my own life is because we're not really any further along in some of these debates. Some of these debates are still going on today. And even though there are scientific and biological explanations of life and death, these more kind of spiritual or transcendental explanations are still argued about and discussed. And in that sense, I think there's a kind of basic humanity that really comes through when you read the Upanishads and these early Buddhist sources, is that you feel like 2,500 years ago, there were people just like us thinking some of the very same things and asking some of the same questions.
I was wondering how much you reckon or consider the social kind of structure of the society at the time influences different ideas, because perhaps the Hindu tradition was in a sense very much involved in justifying a social structure, the caste system, etc. And they had their own origin stories, creation myths, etc. Whereas Buddhism pointedly did not have origin myths or a cosmology as such, and was actually disdainful of that kind of hierarchical structure in society. I mean, there is one sutra that actually a little bit addresses the question, only as far as to say that the caste system, the social system, is purely man-made. So isn't perhaps part of the reason they're looking at self in a different way is because their agendas are very different. One is very much interested in upholding a social system. The other is almost kind of not rejecting it necessarily, but kind of distancing itself from it.
Another very good question. I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right in the sense that they had different ideas of self, and they were articulating these ideas within a context in which other differences were going on. So even though, on the one hand, the issue of self was very important, on the other hand, it was never just about the self, even when they're arguing these things. However, I don't think that any kind of idea of a political structure would necessarily predetermine the kind of views that a particular group would come up with about the self. So for example, there are other rival groups at the time, like the Jains and the Ajivikas, who also disagreed with Brahmanical ideas or Hindu ideas about the self, but then they took different routes into what sort of self that they would put forth. So in other words, just because they rejected the kind of status quo at the time, I wouldn't say that that position in and of itself would in any way necessarily lead to a rejection of self position, if you know what I mean. The other thing is, I don't think, although you're right that I think the Buddhist tradition rejected the social hierarchy as it was articulated by the Hindus. On the other hand, I think that early Buddhism is far more hierarchical and far more interested in origin myths and some of the very things that you're suggesting than sometimes we realize. I think that there's a lot of evidence to support that. It's not so much that they rejected the Brahmanical social hierarchy completely, it's rather they saw it differently.
I think we should be careful to not read too much history back into this material. Part of the crucial argument there was not about ideas that we nowadays think of as caste. It was much more pointedly about whether the authority to teach lay primarily with Brahmins or not. The Buddha and Mahavira were Kshatriyas, they were princes. And already in the Upanishads you have sometimes kings playing the teaching role. The question was how much of that was an exception. Whereas in the Buddhist and Jain materials of that time, the teachings that are attributed to the Buddha or to Mahavira, Brahmins are very much, the term Brahmin is used for learned people. So it's not a rejection of that at all. It, however, becomes a contestation over where the sources of spiritual interpretation and authority lie. Whether it's possible, therefore, for Kshatriyas and other high caste males to equally be teachers. Whether what allows them to have the qualification to teach should consist of certain forms of training in the textual sources of the Vedas, or whether it can be arrived at in other ways. For example, as the Buddha claimed had happened through his own experience. So those were, as Brian was saying, very much more those issues, and we should be very careful not to have a sort of an anachronistic, particularly a modern Buddhist reconstruction of Hinduism, caste system, Buddhism, rejection. What happens is we kind of lose the context in which those kinds of debates happened, particularly, of course, in their relationship to the philosophical arguments, because the Upanishads themselves also have challenge, in fact, preceding Brahmanical ideas about authority, about the nature of the self, about cosmology. So what was happening at that time was a great deal of flux that was coagulated into particular positions by subsequent historical, especially modern historical developments.
I just wanted to raise one point which I think is very important, is the fact that how many people actually had access to the Upanishads themselves. It was a secret teaching, wasn't it? I mean, so much of it they had to go through initiation in order to have access to this knowledge. And when the Buddhists came along and they tried to argue with these people who had been initiated, they were hamstrung by the fact that they couldn't reveal these secret doctrines, which, there was a lot of secrecy, and they believed also that the knowledge of the self, it conferred power to work wonders and miracles.
Mm. Now, that's a very interesting question about the secrecy of the Upanishads. The Upanishads present themselves as secret teachings. And not only that, but they're part of a wider group of textual sources called the Vedas. And in order to learn the Vedas, one had to be of a certain class in society. And, you know, in a sense, it was kind of a closed system, if you will. The Upanishads, more than other Vedic sources, actually advertise themselves as being secret. Now, I think to a certain extent, they were certainly elitist. You know, so they weren't like widely distributed. But there are a number of ways in which perhaps they're not quite as secret as they claim to be. One way is that we know that certainly from our Buddhist sources, that a lot of the early converts to Buddhism were Brahmins. It's hard to know exactly how, because we just don't have access to that sort of information and statistic. But from scholars who have looked at all the people represented in the text and looking at what their class background is, you know, anywhere from maybe 20 or 30% of the early Buddhists were converting from Brahmanism. Now, maybe not every one of those people had memorized the Upanishads and other Vedic sources, but it's certainly, I think, probable that you had a lot of people actually within the Buddhist community who not only was kind of generally familiar with these sources, but knew them by heart. And I think that has something to do with this shared literary culture between them, why it was so effective then to use some of the same stories or the same terminology. If we think of some of the converted Brahmins as part of the architects of this new textual tradition coming out of Buddhism. We also know that in subsequent Hindu texts, such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in particular, that some of the same characters from the Upanishads, sometimes even their teachings, show up in texts that are, in this case, self-advertised as being very widely available. And authored by people that don't claim to be nearly as elitist or traditional. And so I have explored this in some of my research of, in a sense, questioning how secret the Upanishads really were in the first place. So I would agree that they were definitely elitist, but on the other hand, I think that they might have been distributed at least a little bit more widely than we might think from just reading, you know, just taking the claims of the text at face value.
Is there a possibility that just part of it was held back and the rest was promulgated?
Perhaps, yeah. And also the other thing too is that the Upanishads that we have, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways they're akin to the sorts of sources we have from the pre-Socratics. I mean, we could call some of the Upanishads that we have as basically fragments. Even though we'll never know, in my own mind, I'm absolutely sure there were probably hundreds and hundreds of more Upanishads at the time in which they were composed. And now we just have a little bit of window into what was probably a much more widespread group of texts.
We could also make the converse point that with the Buddhist teachings in particular, they are initially especially located as deliberately subverting a particular form of elitism to talk to a wider audience. But in fact, a great many of those discussions are very strictly limited to the Buddha's very close followers, and nobody else has access to it either. So you have this constant dialectic throughout that history of claims to elitism which then percolate out, and then claims to popular teachings which then turn out to be quite limited. And I think that's a general intellectual point, that certain forms of transmission of knowledge end up being elite because only some people have the persistence and the qualifications and the social access, while at the same time there is the recognition that some forms of teaching have to be much more widely disseminated. And of course, there is the contradiction within the Upanishads itself that some of the famous dialogues are held, for example, in a court with a far wider audience.
Yeah.
So you have that constant oscillation, I think, between those two positions in all of these ancient traditions. Great, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Very much.
Thanks.